So welcome back again. I'd like to start off this session. It's the final session, session 7 of 7 for the summer series that I've shared. I'm grateful for the opportunity to work with people and to share some ideas. I have to say this final session it's one of my favorites. Perhaps we should have begun with it. There's lots of things and conversations that we can have about this, but it's on the concepts and the topic of social emotional competencies. I'll run through this today with sharing some ideas, some research, as I usually do. But I have to say this is a kind of a special topic because it's really integral to teaching, but it's also just really integral to people and humans and relationships and communication and all of these things that we do inside and outside of teaching and learning. But from my point of view, what I have found through the past 20 years is that this is really a major component of a successful teacher. I think if people really start to ask these questions and to dig down, and a lot of people frequently say things like that, like what makes a good teacher, or who's your favorite teacher, or why was that a favorite teacher? You know, every student will start to give you ideas and they'll start to share with you some of the experiences. And from my experience, and actually from the research, a lot of the reasons comes down to this concept of social emotional competency. And it does go by a lot of different names. And so maybe if that doesn't like resonate with you now, maybe when I start to share some of the derivatives and some of the things that have gone through time of what this has been called, maybe you'll start to really attach yourself to some of those terms. And I start off with this kind of attempt at humor. I don't know, maybe it doesn't transfer into other languages, but this is a very popular situation comedy in the US. I think it's been around for a decade. I tend to like it as a science person. There's a character named Sheldon Cooper, and he basically he's very analytical about his life. He's a theoretical physicist. And so I put this up here to represent as probably one of the extremes of somebody who probably doesn't have a very high social emotional competency level. And so we can kind of start this as the baseline, and we'll kind of work from there. Over the next hour, 50 minutes or so, I'm hoping that when we're done, we'll be able to discuss the difference between things like social emotional competency, which I'll abbreviate as SEC, and also things like IQ, intelligent quotient, which you probably are aware of. It's been around for decades, and EQ, which is this emotional quotients. And I'll try not to confuse you, but there's a few major authors and a few kind of differences in these terms. The bottom line is I'll try to make it as straightforward as possible and thinking more about the attributes than actually defining these. And we'll analyze some strategies, some things that we may be able to use in our classroom to help really capitalize on the power of social emotional competency to help our students learn and maybe even encourage them to build their EQ, their SEC. And then we'll evaluate a bit of this research to apply to our teaching. A quick kind of a background. Again, I don't think I've worked with this for a while, actually for about 12 years. I actually assisted a university about a decade ago build a center for social emotional competency. And so I know a little bit about this, and I really try to integrate this, but it's been around for a while in various forms. In the mid 60s, actually, as a person kind of came up with this thought that there might be something more than just intelligence, and there was something else going on. And then in the 80s, a lot of people are probably familiar with Howard Gardner's frames of mind and multiple intelligence. So this was the beginning of education, thinking about how we might be attaching some of these emotional parts to what we learn and how we learn. And then Keith Beasley came up with this EQ and called this an emotional quotient. I have to say that most of my experience does come from the mid 90s when I was working at an engineering firm. And many of us were reading Daniel Goleman's work. And at this point, he came out with a book that he talked about calling it emotional intelligence. And I think it was this kind of it wasn't a contradiction. It was kind of a supplemental to intelligence in general. It was another part of intelligence that was above and beyond academic intelligence, and how that might work, not side by side or parallel, but in supplement, and how can it actually almost what I would say supersize or supercharge some of our intelligence. And I do still kind of talk about this a lot when I teach, about how our students can learn some facts, or they can even learn some concepts, some theories, some models. But how are they going to apply that? How are they going to internalize it? How are they going to actually help other people understand some of these concepts and these conversations? And I think that's where this connectedness comes. I'm sure that you have met people throughout your lives and experiences, and even some students that are better at this than others. And the one thing that I do want to say, that I will tend to rely, and I'll tend to use the term social emotional competency and not intelligence, because there was a research group that found that it was a competency. You'll see Richard Boyatzis, who has a great MOOC that's free and available if you're interested in that. They kind of realized early on, and just about a couple decades ago, that it is a competency. And that may seem like a small point, but it's actually a pretty large point, in that intelligence, some people believe it's just that you're born with intelligence, but a competency can be learned. So it's a skill set that can be learned, which is really good news for folks that maybe don't really have some emotional competencies to begin with. Our students, there's a lot of optimism that they can actually grow and learn and become better at this skill. So let's talk a little bit about Goldman's approach. He talks about a couple different stages of this, and the first part of this being what's called self-awareness. This is this kind of concept of really knowing, what are we feeling, what are our strengths, what are our things that we'd like to do, that we have done. And this is kind of interesting, because we all do this whenever we're asked to evaluate ourselves. Typically, maybe at the end of the semester, or even a job application, somebody will ask us, what are your greatest strengths and what are your weaknesses? Some of us are better than this than others, and there's a lot of things that really come with this. Is if you do talk too much about your weaknesses, or if you're too proud of some of your strengths. And so this is this awareness to really look at this in maybe more of an analytical way. So if you do mention some of your strengths, what kind of evidence do you have to support those? If you mention some, are you aware of some weaknesses? Are you just stating those, or do you have some sort of an agenda or some sort of an action plan to address some of those? So there's various levels of this self-awareness. Number 2 is actually one of my favorite ones, and you may recall that one of the earlier sessions that we've done talked quite a bit about self-regulated learning, or self-regulation in learning. And I specifically spoke to this concept for online learning, which was some research that I started about 20 years ago. But this is this concept of are you able to kind of in a cyclic manner ask yourself, how are things going? Are they going well? Are they not going well? How can I implement various things to check and double check, and if they're not going well, create some action items? But this is it could be a bit obsessive, but it can be healthy to really just constantly ask yourself these questions. Many times our students don't do that, maybe with their emotions, but definitely with their learning. And that's sometimes people say, well, that's the teacher's job. Maybe not, but definitely your students aren't going to be with you forever. So we need to help them be able to develop some of these self-regulated skills. And obviously social skills, really the first screen that I showed of Sheldon Cooper, that he has very limited social skills. He doesn't know what to do many times. He doesn't know when to laugh, when to smile, what a joke is, what sarcasm is. You may know some people like this that just kind of struggle with this. Again, the good news is that these are teachable skills that we can help people improve upon. And probably the largest one that's really focused on many times, especially with this particular model, is empathy. And that's trying to think about other people, how they might feel based on what you're saying, what you're doing, and really projecting that. And I think that this is another really key attribute of being a good teacher. Some people call it intuition. Some people call it, teachers' insights, and just being able to sense what our students are feeling when they're tired, when they're hungry, when they're understanding, when they're confused. For those ones that aren't able to do that, and even if we think we can, sometimes we're not always correct on that. We talked earlier in our series about formative assessments and gathering some feedback. So that kind of feedback that we're going to get from students on whether they understand something or not could actually be considered part of empathy. And the empathy would be that you do really consider their feelings, and so you're asking them some questions to determine whether they understand something or not. And if they don't, then you follow up and remediate. So there's a lot of weaving in and out of these concepts that we need to really be considering of. And the last one, which I think is going to be really key for some of the online learning that we've been doing, or the mixed mode, or any kind of a change in our environments, is that what's driving any of us, definitely what's driving our students to learn or not to learn, or to do homeworks or to pay attention. Unfortunately, we tend to focus pretty much around the world on what's called extrinsic motivators. And an extrinsic motivator is an external motivator. The most standard one is grades, points, scores. I actually wrote a paper years ago with one of my students, and it was called The Big Fish. And the whole point was, it was a metaphor between some of the aquariums, the sea aquariums kind of a thing, that had these large whales that would jump up for a fish. And we made the metaphor between that and students and teaching. And that many times that's what we kind of acculturate our students into believing, that if they jump high enough, they'll get an A, a fish. And this particular student that I was working with was really concerned about that. And she always was driven more about, why learn and how do we learn, and learning's interesting and learning's enjoyable. And so she was more on the intrinsic motivation. Through her lifetime, she was very much more internally driven by just the sake of knowledge and feeling better about things and learning about things so that she could help other people. And so you can see where that kind of intrinsic motivation really aligns well with empathy. These are the 5 steps, the 5 parts of Goldman's social emotional competency model. And this, if there's one slide that, if you forget everything else that we're going to talk about, if these 5 steps, if you could find a way to integrate some of these into your thoughts and planning and just considerations, this is probably going to be the biggest part of this particular session. Now, they do have ways to measure these. And I've got some links to these. They've got all types of, we'll call them diagnostics. I tend to call them quasi-diagnostics because they really differ. And I'll ask you to really be careful, right? This isn't an IQ test. This isn't a standardized test. It's a diagnostic. It's a measurement form that's going to allow you or your students or somebody to take and to gain a sense of where they might be on the emotional competency scales. As you might imagine, there's plenty of research. Everyone has their scale. Everyone has their inventory, their assessment. These are a few of them that have been going on over the past couple of decades. Feel free to peruse those. I tend to think simpler is better, and so trying to find something that's a little more straightforward, especially for your students. I also think that anytime people use these quasi-pseudo diagnostics, that sometimes the point is, oh, I'm good at this, or oh, I'm not good at this. And actually the real power of this is to be able to identify some areas where we may need some help and focus on those and work on those. And so this is not a kind of a way to defend that what you're doing is okay. It's a way to identify with a laser focus of where you might need some assistance. And so I encourage you to look up some of those. There's even some of these, the graphic at the bottom is just kind of a pain threshold, is they're not questions and answers. They're more Likert scales. They're more kind of trying to get a sense of where you are when you think about things, act about things. And so, but these are the 2 major kind of contemporary researchers that are still doing work on this. So you'll hear me talk now a lot about Goldman and Boyatzis. So why is this stuff important? Why are we even concerned about SEC? And there have been some pretty interesting research on folks that have improved upon their social emotional competencies, that it increases their pro-social behaviors, which leads to collaboration and engagement. We've talked a lot about the benefits of collaboration and engagement, both in the classroom, project-based learning. We did a whole section on that. And then subsequently in the job place. It has increased overall achievement, which has been defined in several ways. It allows students to obviously understand others' perspectives, which is always going to be key. Sound choices on social decision. It decreases their emotional distress, which may be even more powerful these days of folks that are feeling disconnected and uncertain about some of the world's health challenges. But the biggest thing is it is going to increase students' readiness their work relationships, their attitudes, their mental health, and this kind of rolls along the line with the self-regulated learning. How can we use some of these things to enhance some of our discussions? Again, I do like that this came at the end, because now I can refer to all these sessions previously, and we can talk a bit about, we showed clearly that students' active discussions, synchronously, asynchronously, written, graphically, in any way you can get students to think about and represent their conceptual understandings is going to be really key. And so just to expect students to talk and to open up and to make connections may be a little bit difficult. So if they have a low social emotional competencies, they may actually have a hard time with embracing in some of these discussions. So trying to create that safe space, we had a whole session about accessible, inclusive spaces that would allow everybody to feel like they can participate, providing some of these ground rules and repeating those ground rules, modeling those ground rules, providing those appropriate prompts. And those appropriate prompts that we talked about a little before, trying to build self-regulation, you might start to now build upon that conversation that we had and start to think about how you're going to really access students' emotional competencies, their empathies, how they think about the concepts as the concepts relate to each other, and implementing those concepts into some sort of application out in the real world. Divergent questions, obviously. And I really like this last one about these argument skills. I don't know about you, but I have a strong sense, maybe even more these days, that arguments are happening around the world, countries, people, and so forth. But I have to say, one of my best colleagues in the world, we argue constantly, but we're still really close. I think maybe because we respect each other and we respect each other's arguments, and we tend to have some sort of evidence with our arguments, but we truly do try to have some empathy as well as understanding where each other's coming from. And I think it's difficult. Of course it's difficult, right? This is not an easy thing to do. A very young child doesn't want someone to disagree with them, but as adults, which should have more social emotional competencies, we should start to build some of these abilities to be completely collegial with people who completely disagree with us in some maybe important matters. So how is this model connected to education? I'm going to share with you 3 graphic models to think about. One of them, the first one, as old as, now 100 years old, it's hard to believe, that Thorndike kind of came up with these thoughts about social intelligence. And so I can't emphasize enough that some people want to think of these as new, fancy fads. A lot of times you'll hear that the social emotional is a fad. If it is, it's a 100-year fad. So that's a pretty good record of it hanging around. But in education, Thorndike did kind of look at, how we make decisions, why we do things, what we do, and so forth. So this was a fairly simplistic model at the time. I mentioned that Boyatz has come up with another kind of a thought of these competence. And again, I like Goldman's and Boyatz's work, but I must say that I like this competence. I really focus in on this competence. Maybe it's just because I want to be hopeful that as a competence that myself and my students all can continue to develop. There's always hope for somebody. If they make some mistakes, if they may not be very aware, we can actually help them out. And I think that it's kind of our responsibility as teachers, as adults, as models, to really do that. I think many times we get a little stuck in our content areas and we say, well, I'm a chemistry teacher. It's not my responsibility to teach social emotional competency. And and maybe that, I'm not saying that we should all teach it all the time, because maybe we don't have the background and skill set. But I always kind of think about my job as I'm trying to teach my students how to be a chemist, how to think like a chemist, how to operate like a chemist. And pretty much every job, maybe except in the academic world, chemists have to work with people. They have to work with internal people, external people, clients, sell things, manage things, create products, quality control, have conversations. Now, these are all super key to social emotional competency. And I would imagine that every single content area that each of you have, there's some attributes that you want students to have a conversation with the general public, with the business public, with something out there, that they need some of these competencies. And the last one is Goldman's work. I kind of mentioned these as a list of 5. They're not in order. And sometimes when I present these lists, it looks like there's a hierarchy, or you do step 1 and step 2. It is more of this cycle, and you kind of go in and out of these cycles. You may bounce around to these cycles, but these are 5 attributes that I think can be complementary if we really present them in that way, and if students start to kind of attend to them in a way that helps them become this holistic person. So what about our students? Emotional intelligence, their social emotional competencies. I'm sure that many of you have been teaching for a while, and you probably have noticed some things. Maybe you didn't call it emotional intelligence or social emotional competencies, or maybe you didn't use these attributes, but many teachers are really kind of the key in on some of these things. So thinking about, what are some of the strongest attributes that your students possess of these, and what do you notice with some students struggling, especially over the past few months when there's some things that have happened in our world, and schools have shut down, and online, and different stresses that have gone on. I'd love it if you think about this for a second, and we are at 8:25, so I'm going to do a little bit of a pause for a couple minutes, and just maybe we can digest some of the things that we've talked about. But if you'll write some of your ideas in the chat, and I will go out now and click on that chat. There's been a great about 20 ideas out there. So feel free to verbalize some things. Feel free to chat some things. We'll spend just about a minute to do a bit of processing, as we know. And I'm going to try to just casually talk and read some of these. Yep, I have to say, I should have mentioned that at the very beginning. Someone has a great comment about my very first slide. You have to know a little bit about physics, pretty basic physics, to understand some of these humors. I guess that's why I like this show. Fortunately, the show has a canned laughter to let you know when a joke happens if you happen to miss it. Great. Excellent. Yes, somebody makes a good point about UBD, the understanding by design. Wiggins and McTighe talk a lot about empathy and connections. Excellent, thank you. Love the connections here. Internal and external motivation. A lot of times people talk to me about that, about how can we get students to be more intrinsically motivated. I'm not sure I have the best answer. I have an answer that works for me. Because I firmly believe this, and most of the research supports this, that our students don't show up to school, to class, wanting to ignore us, wanting not to learn. As young people around the world, young people, 4, 5, 6, 7 years of age, are really good natural scientists. And I'll say that as a chemist, but I'll say it as a social science person as well, is that they have questions, and they're constantly asking questions and collecting data and observing things and pondering and making lots of mistakes. And so I think that young people are intrinsically motivated to learn. Then we do this weird thing where we tend to formalize and bringing them into schools, and we train them. I say not to educate them, but we train them that, they've got to do homeworks and get points. And I think, especially during their developmental years, they kind of buy into that. And then as they grow up, I think it's easy to forget just the joy of learning. And so I do think that inside of every human being is this natural affinity to want to learn and to see the value of learning. As teachers, it may be some challenges of ours to find ways and avenues to bring that out. Great. Reading some more of these. Yep, a little 5-minute break. So if you needed to go and get a drink or walk away, that's fine. And I'll read these. Thanks, students. Good. Love it. I really appreciate the chat. I have to say that I've been doing tons of these Zooms sessions over the past 8 months now. And I think that people are starting to also acclimate to the chats and realize you can do public chats and private chats. And this is one of the best formative assessments for me, so that I can kind of figure out like what are they getting out of this? What is it that students are really capitalizing on? What are they more interested in? This could also be another way to attend to students in a social emotional way of I hope that now I'm more empathetic about some of your thoughts. Maybe I'm trying to decipher some of these things and seeing what's motivating you. And so these are really clear ways. I think sometimes people think all these are separate. And I think that how we function as humans, most of the research that I've shared today and before are really just helping us do our jobs better and teach better and connect better. A lot of times people think that teaching is either easy or it's just telling. And you may recall the book that I shared early on by Don Finkel. I still love the title of this book, Teaching with Your Mouth Shut. And he does differentiate between the concept of teaching and telling. I think we've probably all had some experiences with teachers that just told us things as opposed to actually ones that taught us things. And in one sentence, he summarizes that, we can't really learn anything from anybody. All we can do is create an environment for which people can learn. And I think this really lines well with the social emotional competencies. So we need to develop an environment that kind of attends to how people and students can learn. All right, great. That was a nice little halftime commercial break. Hopefully you've got a little bit rejuvenated and made some sense of the past 25 minutes. Let's go ahead and push forward. And I do want to make some connections between some of our prior knowledge. So I'm assuming that a lot of people have heard the term IQ, right? This is real popular in pop culture around the world. What's your IQ? How smart are you? And this is typically a measure, and you might look up some of the research. It's known to be highly flawed, but it's trying to get at this intellectual ability that you have. How can you reason? What's your math and English skills and your ability to concentrate and plan? Whereas the EQ, which is this abbreviation, which is another abbreviation for emotional quotients. So try to think about SEC and EQ is kind of the same thing from two different researchers. It's talking about, it's more than this, and it's the capacity to objectively look at things and assess your strengths and weaknesses, as I mentioned earlier. Look at the challenges and limitations. So it's much deeper. It's much more complex. It's much more sometimes timely, these microseconds that happen. And hopefully you can stop to think for a second, when have you made good decisions, and have those decisions come from really carefully considering things, or have you done things on an impulse? We're all humans. We all make mistakes. We all get happy and sad and upset. And I think that these are some of the things that our students sometimes don't understand, that it does take some time to really think about some things and weigh them out. As we become older, hopefully the time frame, we can make these decisions in a little bit more smaller time frame. I think there's also this really interesting concept that I've learned through the time of what's called decision fatigue. And even the best of us, if we have to make a lot of decisions and have to really focus on our social emotional competencies, it's like our muscles, it's like running, it's like walking, we'll get tired. And so sometimes our ability to make really good decisions gets tired. This is an attribute that we need to be aware of. And so we probably should stop making decisions when we are fatigued. We should stop doing anything important, high stakes, and students should also kind of learn these kind of skills as well. So IQ and EQ aren't opposites. They're not the same. They're both really important, and we probably need both of those, but we also need to know when to capitalize on one versus the other. So earlier I gave you a really simple schematic. Obviously, this is not simple stuff. This is very intense stuff. And they're continuing to do some research on this. Goldman has come out with his kind of emotional intelligence quotients a few years ago. And it really does now break it down into this concept of, you'll see some terms that are going over and over as far as, now self-expression and interpersonal and decision-making and stress management, well-being. These are all some things so this is a bit of a dial to figure out, after you've mastered some of these, the basic ones, how are you going to take the next steps? And we as instructors probably should be working on this level, and then the students kind of on some of the simpler, straightforward levels. And then Boyatzis has got another kind of, and both of these are links that I've posted, or I will post on our shared Google document, so you can look into it, read more, find out more about these. But I just wanted to make sure that we didn't think that this thing was, these concepts were overly simplified. They actually are incredibly detailed and deep. Our challenge is figuring out how much and how deep that we need to go, realizing that we have full-time jobs and content areas, and this should be part that's supplementing a lot of those. So there is a lot of research that has been done, it is being done. There's many countries in the world, especially K through 12, that are incorporating emotional intelligence, emotional competencies inside of their curriculum. It's not being as a course, but it's being part of courses. So you may have some of that in your institutions. You may be seeing it come your way, but there definitely is some major components that are going on, like social awareness, relationship management, especially students trying to get along with each other, play well with each other, learn well with each other, manage their time, manage their relationships. So these are some things that people are finally realizing that it's really, really advantageous to students, not just in their learning, but in their just well-being. The Journal of Annual Psychology came out with some things some just highlights that I'll share of if we can help our students improve their social emotional competency, what's going to happen? Well, they're going to have better achievement. They're literally going to score better on tests, which is not everything, but it's going to be an indicator of some other things. They're going to have better relationships with each other, with you possibly, with their colleagues, and also at home and just everywhere. There's going to be less aggression. There's been pretty much a spike of aggression pretty much around the world, but definitely in some schools. And I don't know about you, but most instructors and teachers don't have a really deep background in how to handle that, how to manage that. And so instead of trying to manage it on the back end, maybe trying to encourage some of the social emotional competencies on the front end will reduce some of that, so we have less of that to work with. And then obviously there's going to be more positive, pleasant people around us. And we know that the research is clear that when we have people, whether they're students or whether they're colleagues, in a positive environment, the brain is just more open to learning and connections and conversations and collaborations. And so all of these, they're really not small, they're really large facets that are going to allow us to think about how we might ultimately do what we're here to do, which is help students learn and use what they've learned in the future. And the well-being is really key. I teach an environmental chemistry course, and I certainly teach the content, but I try to remind my students that a bit of it sounds overly simplified, but if they're not eating well, if they are feeling kind of down, if they're not sleeping, if they're whatever, there is the chances of them actually doing well in school, understanding things and working with things are going to be lower. So we need to take care of ourselves in many ways. And this is just one kind of mental health way that we can do this. There are some criticisms that I do want to point out. Obviously, there's no perfect remedy, no magic bullet, but there are some criticisms of emotional intelligence. It's not formally recognized as an intelligence, and again, I lean towards the competency scale. It may measure conformity, not ability, and this is a big concept to unpack. Some people see this as if you have a diagnostic, if you have scales, if you have measures, sometimes, especially young people, will try to adapt themselves to what most people are doing. And then, so it's called social emotional. So society might have some norms that they're trying to build in. And so people may be trying to be whatever it is that they anticipate or they predict or that you want them to be. It can be confused with other skills. And we call this in social science, it's a very popular approach, concept of confounding variables. If you were to basically score high on some of these, does it really measure your empathy? Does it really measure your social awareness? Or is it maybe confused with some other things like character, morals, ethics? And I'm not going to go into those areas. I'm not qualified to talk very deeply about those, but I'm here to say that I think, along with not being, one answer, I think we just need to be aware of some of these challenges and go into it with this. But at the same time, some people will say, well, I'm not going to do it at all because it could be confused with these other things. I think that also is not probably the best approach because there's a lot of positive things that can come from this. Like any quasi pseudo diagnostic, and I've said this many times before, is that whenever we self-report, and you may recall from our assessment, measurement, and evaluation section that we talked about self-reporting and what we call direct and indirect measures. This would be an indirect measure, which means that it's going to be highly biased off of some sort of a survey. I still really, I think that we need indirect measures. We always say that they're necessary but insufficient. And so we need to follow up with some sort of a direct measure. And so if somebody self-reports in a way, then maybe as an instructor, we collect direct measures to either validate or kind of remediate what their thoughts are about their ultimate conclusion of their social emotional competency. We all know some folks that may think that they're highly empathetic and that they aren't. And so the problem isn't their social emotional skills. The problem is their ability to evaluate, their ability to gather data, to analyze data, to be open to conclusions that may not be altogether pleasant. And they say that at this current point, there's little predictive value. Again, I think that follows along with the previous bullet in that most self-reported do not currently have predictive value, but that's why we want to do things like triangulate our data and find other sources that allows us to collect enough data to be able to have some sort of predictive value. I do want to kind of end up with a couple of other things that you may have heard about, and these are some terminology, some research. I'm not going to go deep into these, but chances are you've heard of these, and I just want to share with you that these are kind of emotional intelligence, social emotional kind of tangents. These are some ideas that are coming out fairly recently, things like growth and fixed mindsets. I'm sure that you've heard or read some of Carol Dweck's work. Persistence, students that are able to persist and get through some things. That's kind of one of the attribute, a sidebar of having this social emotional competency. And then Duckworth came out with this concept of grit, the people that just kind of roll up their sleeves and keep moving along, being aware of what they know, how they feel, but still getting the job done and still making sure that things are completed. These all have positives and negatives. I'm not here to endorse any of them. I'm just here to make sure that that you're aware that the research knows that these things are going on. And to be quite frank, I'm a chemist. What do I know about some of these? But I do know that the brain, emotions, human connections are incredibly complicated. And therefore, being a teacher with a bunch of young people who have brains who are incredibly complicated, I think we need to be aware of these, not be experts at them, but anything that we can know about these so that we can do a better job at identifying, providing assistance and resources to our students, and so they ultimately can be the best well-being that they are. And then ultimately, if they get to that point, they'll be able to kind of attend to and engage in our concepts as much as possible. So that was a wrap up. I know that was a whole lot of information. I'm a little bit shorter than usual, but I wanted to make sure that you've got that information. Any more that I'd go into it, I'd have to really kind of go down various models. If there's any of those models that you really like, I'd encourage you to explore those. If you'd like to have other conversations with me, happy to explore those. But I'm hoping that gives you enough sense of what this could be, especially thinking about this as an umbrella kind of a concept that might wrap around a lot of the things that we've talked about throughout the past 7 weeks. So I'm going to stop the recording now, and then I'm happy to take some questions and chat for the next 10 or 15 minutes.